Hi, I'm Randy Altman with Post Perspective. What you're about to see is an interview conducted by our writer Ben Mehlman with the three editors on Apple TV's 5 Days at Memorial. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
I was wondering how much were you all aware of the details around Hurricane Katrina and what actually happened at Memorial before starting the show?
For me, I hate to say it, I knew that Katrina was bad. I didn't realize the extent of how bad it was. And then once John had told us that we're doing this project, I read the book, and then you're just, your mouth is agape at like sort of everything that happened, from the beginning to the end. It's just it's unbelievable. And then a large component of the show was us doing these what I call them just like little documentaries in between. And I think both Joanne and Colin can attest to this. Like once you start watching that, it's unbelievable because these are this is real footage of what's happening, and we got to see a lot of stuff that probably never made it to news outlets, and so I think that was very fascinating to see. But yeah, I think we actually literally had a bin. I mean, this is how bad it was. We had a bin of like dead bodies. Like it was just footage of how many dead bodies were sort of just floating around the city and not being handled. And so, but to basically answer your question, I didn't know a lot, and then now I know more than I want to know in some ways. But yeah. I mean, and I'm glad that people, as hard as it is, I'm glad that people are watching, because now I think almost anybody who watched it, barring people in New Orleans, are saying the same thing, that they had no idea to the extent.
Yeah, and I think just to jump onto that, I think that's what's really kind of interesting about the subject matter of the show, is that most people, even people who weren't around for Katrina, at least know about it. And those of us who are old enough, we remember that it was bad. We probably remember George Bush's flyover and those sorts of things. We might not know all the details, but definitely the story around Memorial seems like a relatively unknown story, or at least underknown, I guess, to make up a phrase. And it was reported on CNN and some other things, but it was something that for a lot of people was just, shocking to hear about, and just being an unknown sort of chapter or detail regarding Katrina, I think makes it a very interesting watch. And as Lou's saying, like, it is instructive for a lot of people to, they're learning something about the storm and its aftermath and everything that they literally didn't know before. So I think that's an interesting aspect of the show.
Yeah, being from Texas, I'm sort of like a little bit more, my ears sort of peak up when you hear about something like that. And I remember visiting New Orleans probably 10 years after it happened, and I was shocked about how you could still feel it and see the damage that was created there. And I think the hospital, even though I didn't know the details of it, serves as sort of a microcosm of the breakdown of everything. And so it gives you sort of this intimate perspective of, the failure on so many people's parts in a larger sense with the whole city. So yeah, interesting.
So then, as you guys are talking about the weight of the story and whatnot, like how was it balancing the drama and the need of the narrative you're telling with like the real events that took place? Because there's obviously like an extra layer of, it's not just what is the narrative propulsion, but like it is beyond just telling the best version of the story. And how was it balancing that?
And to me, it's an added, you could almost call it an added burden. There's an added weight knowing that, especially someone like Emmett Everett, but so many other characters, knowing that this is indeed a portrayal of a real person. And he has children and grandchildren that are still alive that might at least know about the show, whether they choose to watch it or not, I don't know. But the doctors and nurses, many of them are still around. Katrina wasn't that long ago, 17 years at this point. So it's an added thing that makes us take it, serious in a different way, I think.
And the balance, was something that sort of found its way. We started off feeling like, oh yeah, we want it for this reason or that reason. And John really wanted to make sure it wasn't, in lieu of being able to shoot something or have a good VFX or something. But the way we've used it is in a lot of different ways. It's not just to, set up an environment, a traditional way of using archival. It's also to sort of flash into like somebody's worst nightmare about what could be happening out there, even though they're not literally seeing something. So it's used as an emotional element to help heighten really the mental state of our characters throughout this. And so sort of as we put it in, the more people liked it and the more people wanted of it. So the balance sort of like had to find its way as we went organically.
Yeah, and I think it's I think sort of jumping on what Joanne said there, it's like the footage obviously is real people, and so that put a real face on this sort of tragedy and seeing these individuals dealing with the aftermath of the storm and all this stuff. And so yeah, and even to what Joanne's saying too, it's like there was a period there where we were kind of trying to figure out how much of this archival footage we want to put in, because there were points where we almost did go too far and it started desensitizing us. And so that we were like, okay, we have to find that balance. And then, I think probably one of the most interesting things that Carlton told me was when he met with more specifically Cherry Jones and Vito Farmiga, that they both of them said, without having talked to each other before, had said that they were going to be fierce advocates for their characters, is the literal quote. And like, I think it's really important in telling this story that you give a balanced and a not a skewed perspective. And so we, those characters were trying, and you can see it sort of in the writing and the acting and everything we've tried, is that they tried to do what they could, but we didn't give our sort of judgment on what was happening. We were sort of, almost more of like an accounting of the events as opposed to a perspective of the events.
I mean, I think I guess not a question, but a statement. I think you guys did a great job of that. I think that, it's kind of like the trolley dilemma of like, there are no good choices, but creating empathy for the people who should not have necessarily been in that scenario. And I think, you answered a question that I was very curious about, of the idea of the balance of the archival footage versus narrative. And I think you do strike a really good balance, because it also comes in at the times where you're reminded that this is a real story. And it weirdly at least gave me a little freedom to kind of know, okay, in the hospital is like a narrative, but like the essence of all of this is like getting at something. So I went to Colin, this was for you. So I saw that you worked on Let It Fall with John, and I was wondering if that experience, especially with him, like helped you tackle a narrative from like a true story, having that doc background with him, especially with the archival footage.
Yeah, definitely. And Lou and Joanne were actually on this show a little bit before me, and they also are masters with all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head in a lot of ways. The archival is there sort of to ground you as the audience and remind you that this is real. And another thing it did was sort of contextualize things. So yeah, I mean, coming from Let It Fall and doing this, it is the same process. Whether it's a 2-hour doc or a 1-minute vignette within 5 days at Memorial, the approach is the same. So that there was a lot of similarities for me in that.
Yeah.
And I'd like to add that, we, both Joanne and I loved Colin's work on Let It Fall so much and we were so overwhelmed by the documentary footage for this project that we were just like, hey, maybe Colin should just handle this all by himself. But then, it was such a huge thing, and it was. Yeah. But I do want to just say that Colin's particularly good at it, and so we appreciate him being on the team.
And if I'm not mistaken, you guys all worked with John before and worked together. I think it was on American Crime. And like, did this help create like a shorthand or like a creative energy on this show? Since you know, you didn't necessarily have some of the first day of school energies you might if it's a newer group.
It's a very open, I mean, I I kind of compare us to siblings or something. We don't always agree, and we can get into it. But it's really our approaches with love and openness and transparency. The way that I was very easily able to show my cut to both of these people and 100% take all of their notes and criticism, knowing that it would make my work stronger. You know, that is a really special and unique position to be in, to have that trust amongst your colleagues. And lots of times in TV, it's very easy to sort of, you know, get competitive or something like that. And it was really nice to have that openness. And also because of the structure of the way we went into this, and we are shooting things at a different time, kind of big blocks. A lot of us had our hands in different episodes. And so it sort of made it even easier to kind of have that cohesive, you know, those discussions about these episodes in a very familiar way that everybody knows exactly what's going on. And then there was just the, you know, having worked with John, all of us together, we also know kind of what he was going to go for, kind of the way we would gear things. We kind of had the shorthand for like, hey, do we want to do this? Like, we all know what we're saying, even though it probably wouldn't make sense if I said it out loud. And so, I mean, that made it really enjoyable too. I think one of my favorite things from this whole process was having this like deep creative connection with these two people, and really trusting them and relying on them sometimes to help. You know, I'm stuck, I'm at this point, here's a cut and I don't know where to go from here. So, you know, it was really great to have that feedback and that openness.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the type of work that we both did on American Crime and on this show, we're always trying to push the boundaries, as John likes to say, the language of cinema. We want to push those boundaries, and so when you're doing that, it's easy to get lost in the woods without somebody else to consult. And since we've all sort of been working together for so long, have known each other, and have done this similar type of work, it was great to have that shorthand and to be able to chat and discuss things. And, you know, and also, you know, I think one of the things that we've talked about all the time is like, what do we think we would have done? Or like, what do we think happened? Or like, you know, what are these right choices? And I think you make a great point, Ben, about sort of, I never really thought of it until now, but it's obvious. It's the trolley problem. It really is. Mm. And you know, it's a version of that, but in real life. And so, but yeah, I mean, these topics are so complicated that like you need people that you can trust and have real, honest, deep discussions with, and that's what you know. I think we were lucky enough that the three of us have worked together and were able to move into that fairly quickly.
And also to vent and be like, this is so heavy.
I feel like a lot of our Zoom sessions were like the variety of people going on walks because we couldn't deal with the footage.
That was actually going to be one of my questions that I can jump to now. Like, were there any practices to protect your mental health while working on such a dark show? And obviously, there are dark shows, but a dark show that carries the weight of truth behind it, where I think it may weigh even heavier than if you were working on just, you know, a narrative show where you could at least be like, these are pretend people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the walks were definitely part of almost, I think, every single one of us. We're all dog parents, and so I think the animals helped us a lot too. But you know, it's funny. I think, and I'm curious to see what Joanna and Connor say this, because, you know, what I end up doing to sort of deal with it outside of the direct work of it is like, I end up watching way more comedies when I'm working on these types of shows. And like, it's funny too, because like John hasn't specifically said that, but I find him almost always watching like half-hour comedies if he's not working. So when we were on American Crime, he used to watch Veep all the time, and Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. So like, I think you have to create an escape space somewhere else.
Definitely. And another thing is also, and Lou alluded to this earlier, just kind of the tone sometimes on our collective Zoom calls, or if we're working with Carlton, was kind of, jocular and jovial, when appropriate. And I remember even one time I was meeting up with Carlton over Zoom to work with him on something, and I, without much of a preamble, I just started showing him the cut, and he was like, wait, we have to chit chat first. Like, tell me what's going on. Like, how are you? Like, let's do a little banter, and that was definitely a big part of our communications.
Carlton's really great at sort of like lifting you through through some of the darker moments, and making it fun, and sort of also allowing you to step back and not be so, I mean, I think we all work from an emotional space, and when you're constantly accessing that deep, heavy feeling, it's kind of hard to not lose that sort of tunnel vision. And he was really good at sort of jolting us out of there and making jokes and telling a funny story to get us all all in a lighter mode, which was, yeah, he was really good. That was nice. Yeah.
I imagine it's quite good to have someone at the top that gives you the permission to like let go of some of that weight for a little bit, because not only does it make I think probably for a better product because it is less burnout, but it's also the ethical and right and humane thing. So it's nice to always hear where someone is taking their leadership role as a creator, but also as like as a managerial person. Well, so a very practical question. What was your guys' post setup? Like, what did you edit on, and how much was remote versus in person?
Actually, I think Joanne, you should probably answer this because you actually were the ones who sort of led us down we work remote, but we Joanne had a system that we had not ever used before, and frankly, for me, it ended up being perfect. Like it was amazing.
Yeah, we were on an Amulet, and it was through blanking on
Technicolor,
Technicolor.
streamlined.
Yes. And it was seamless. We were all, I think that's another aspect of this that was also pretty intense, was that we were working from home. This entire thing was remote. And so, especially with all the elements going on, you would think that could be really challenging, but because of this good relationship that we all had, we would regularly do Zooms and all that stuff. But yeah, we were set up, and the Amulet was great. It was really seamless for us three. It was great. So
yeah, it's the parent company name is Teradici, and then the thing we were using is Amulet. But yeah, it was, I mean, honestly, I would forget that I didn't have the Avid in the room with me. It was that seamless because we were doing some, I mean, everybody does precise cuts, but we were doing some very specific cuts, and we just felt like the other systems weren't giving us that precision that we needed to know. And so it was flawless. It was amazing. And I was just being able to work remotely with everybody, kind of like, it was a challenge, of course, but I think we were all able to manage it fairly well. Again, us three at least being having some history, our assistants, some of them knew each other, and so that helped a little bit too. And so but we all figured it out. But yeah, and again, to try to keep it jovial, I think that the camaraderie helped a lot too.
And
yeah, and the Slack channel.
Yeah.
Okay.
We had a Slack channel. We would have a variety of Slack channels. Some of them were just fun stuff, just to kind of keep everybody's mind.
And just to add one more thing briefly before we go to the next thing, we're also potentially at the start of the project considering moving into in person at some point. And I think because we were so smooth remotely, it just kind of never became a necessity. And it also extended to beyond just the edits. Especially Lou and I were on the project for a while, and ADR or you know,
VFX.
scoring sessions and stuff like that. In VFX reviews, we're attending many of them, and they were all remote.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the thing about this project. I mean, they shot in Toronto, and then they shot in New Orleans, and you know, obviously our showrunners, both Carlton and John, were at those locations, and then you know, ADR was somewhat in Toronto, sometimes in LA, sometimes in New York, and so like the flexibility of all that. And then our VFX company, I mean, we had VFX companies in Europe doing work for us, so it was in some ways we would have probably ended up largely like this anyways because of the nature of the way the new workflow, I think, is of post. So
It was a global production.
Truly. And you said you guys, like the system you use, you edited it on Avid?
yeah.
Yes.
Cool. And I know you mentioned there were walks, like were these like individual walks, or are you guys close enough that you were able to meet in person even if you were working remotely?
You know, I was trying to think about this the other day. We're all friendly, so we you know, we see each other socially every now and then. But I try to think. I don't know if any of us ever got together during the thing. I think it was a little too harried.
No, but sometimes we'd have meetings and, you know, somebody would be, you know, on their treadmill or trampoline or walking around. We would still sort of have that energy of walking together with still being separate, but on a Zoom.
It's the 21st century digital version of
exactly
a walk with your friends.
Yes.
So I know you mentioned that you know, multiple episodes you guys were your hands in. How was the work broken down on episodes that had more than one editor credited, and were there episodes that might have had a, you know, single editor credited that, you know, was kind of a little more homogenous? How was that breakdown?
We sort of made decisions very early on that we're going to be like, this, you're sort of in charge of this one, and you know, you're more or less in charge of this one. But you know, as projects like this go on, where we're sort of like trying to figure out stuff, we're moving some things here and there, especially the documentary footage. So I would say, like, you know, we would be trying to pull from each other's footage sometimes because it was like, oh, but your footage over there, I know it's like doing your thing over there, but we really need to tell this story over here. So we would take, you know, chunks and just move them over. So it was, yeah, I mean, again, the collaboration is easy enough that it was a pretty easy slide back and forth. But for the most part, we just kind of decided who was sort of in charge of whatever thing. But you know, we tried to consult each other for almost everything. So
yeah, Colin came on a little bit later. He was wrapping up his show, and so you know, there was a handoff at some point, you know, I know with episode 2, so I did get a shared credit on that. But like he took it, you know, from such an early stage and all the way through the finish line, and a lot of the creative things that happened in there, that was him. So, and then we just, you know, kind of, you know, there was little scenes sometimes here or there that we had a little input on, but we sort of just decided, like, okay, you know, you get that, you know, we get, and we worked it out. And then at some point I had to leave early. And so they both came in and took over and helped see those episodes through as well. So it really was a team effort in a lot of these.
Yeah, it was such a long show, a long production, that a lot of us came and went at different points in time.
Yeah, I think it's also like the way it was shot, it was so confusing. Like there would be days where they're shooting 102, and then the latter half of the day is 104, and then they shot a small section for 105, and then you just be like,
so was it block shot? I imagine it was maybe like, was it block shot like the first 5 days and then like the last 3 episodes, or?
Kind of. It's complicated because, as you know, the last 3 episodes have a bunch of flashbacks from the, you know, flashbacks. They're actually separate scenes altogether, but they shot them obviously while they're at the hospital. So like those were shot also during 1 through 5, and then there was sometimes scheduling. There would be stuff that was shot for you know, the latter episodes early on too. So it was, I would like to call it block shooting, but it was like a free for all. It was such a complicated production. I mean, our post producer Rauf, he would always be like, I think I have a handle on the schedule, and the next day he'd be like, okay, I have no idea what the schedule is. We just kind of have to play this by ear. And so we were all game for it, and it was fine.
Just let go of the wheel and be like, at some point we'll have all the footage we are supposed to, and we will do our best. How long you mentioned a few times that like post was long, like around about like what were the dates of like how long post-production was?
Well, I was on the longest, and I started in May of 2021, and I finished just shy of May in 2022. And then even then, Colin and I were still, we wanted to continue to be involved, and so we were going to meetings well into June. So this is probably, for me, is the equivalent of like 12 plus months. And then Joanne was next on. And so
I was next on, but then I left end of November. So it was like June through the end of November.
And then as Colin had mentioned, Colin and I had stayed on to sort of shepherd the rest of this towards the end, because it's weird to say it's a VFX heavy show. It's not like a sci-fi show, so it's like, but there's a lot of stuff that had to be recreated that was fairly complicated and required a lot of discussion, and there were story points. They weren't just blow up this building or whatever. It's not like that. So it was so Colin, you were on from what, July
until I guess probably June or so.
June or so, 2022. So it was a long process. It's
and no, it's like, it's you notice the VFXers in the sense that like you're aware that like, oh, this is like a large scale, but it's like, the drama version of some of the like 70s like disaster movies where like, it's very like real in scale. So as you were talking about kind of the shooting, can you talk a little bit about the structure of the show, like, and how it evolved? Like, one of the things I noticed was most of the episodes started with these like really effective interviews, which like brought to mind The Social Network, because it was kind of able to like take into account different perspectives, so you don't necessarily like lock into a singular POV.
I mean, John had always conceived of it that way. John also likes to do this thing, which I mean, he's done in other projects, but also he likes to keep the interviewer away. And I think Colin and I finally realized, as we're well into later in the project, that it's a little bit more like Rashomon, where like these people are asking questions, but you actually never see the people in Rashomon asking those questions. And so and then I think Colin and I went down the rabbit hole of, oh, there's actually a bunch of projects that kind of do this, but it keeps your it keeps a somewhat clean perspective, because you're not involved with the interviewers. You're just trying to hear what the people are saying. But yeah, structurally that was always there. We toyed with other things. I mean, I think we ended up adding an interview at the end of, what was that?
103, we added an end interview.
Yeah. And that evolved as we went on. So, but yeah, I mean, there was in the script though too, there's, there was a one discussion whether or not we would go archive footage, interview, and then the show. But as the thing goes, we were sort of evolving. So some of them still have a little bit of that very straightforward older structure, and some of them don't. And so I think it just kind of varied. But yeah, I don't know if you guys had anything.
I mean, I would say about sort of the global structure of the show. A lot of that came obviously from John and Carlton, who themselves kind of bifurcated the show and sort of had a John half and a Carlton half, which is a little shorter. And Sherry Fink's book is actually like that. She goes through 5 days, and then she also has kind of a second half that's about the investigation into all the stuff that happened. And to me, one thing that was interesting was, although they're two halves of the same coin, they kind of have different themes or intentions. And Ben, I think you actually used this word early on about the first 5 days, which I think is really accurate, which you talked about like empathy. And I think that's a big part of it. I think Lou and Joanne would agree. Like a lot of what we do in the first 5 episodes is about sort of creating empathy for these characters, whether they're a patient or a doctor or an administrator or whoever they are who are sort of thrown into this situation. And then you also alluded to this as well, Ben. So that's great. I think the second half was largely about sort of the futility of seeking concrete answers into a lot of it. So it was sort of different approaches to sort of tackle the same subject matter.
Yeah, and I think to your point there, Colin, it's like I think we always felt like it was such a human story that we wanted to kind of give each character a full picture of who they were as people, and then let the audience sort of, make their own judgments on it. And I think probably the thing that surprised me the most was the range of what people felt about each person. Like, I think one of the things that Colin and I discovered when we were doing ADR was like the different range of what people were interpreting, with sort of each scene and each event. And so it was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and I've talked to quite a few people who've watched the show, and they frequently have different takeaways about the same character, which I think is a good thing. It was certainly an intention of the show to do that.
Awesome. One thing, so comment and then question. I love the Kurosawa and Rashomon connection, because I think especially in the beginning, not showing them like makes you empathize with the interviewees, where it's that idea of like it establishes the big power of like the government kind of, and like the pressure that might be on them, and then it's wild to then go into the hospital and like not have that presence, where you're like, why is that presence here after the fact, opposed to like where the power really should be. So since you mentioned the flashbacks in the last 3 episodes, it obviously you had the option, but were there any scenes that belonged on the first 5, or that you were able to switch around or put in, because you do have that narrative option to not necessarily keep it linear?
Colin, you should probably answer that more, since you were sort of more in charge of the latter episodes. But
yeah,
the scripts were very well thought out, I would say. But go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that. I mean, it was maybe a consideration fleeting once or twice, but really it was kind of scripted that way, because the flashbacks are coming in the latter episodes. They're coming off of interviews that are specifically scripted and, are also following the contours of the real investigation. And, they're subjective. So sometimes they are a little different than what you see in the first 5 days. And they're also shot a little differently. So you definitely could not do the reverse and use a flashback in the first 5. Although we definitely took shots and things like that from scenes that were shot for the first 5 and put them, maybe reusing them or using them for the first time, just as a shot in the latter 3. But again, most of it was, it was really in these scripts, like Lou was saying. And again, I would just say also based on Sherry Fink's reporting, that really laid the groundwork to these sort of like big sort of story cornerstones.
It makes sense when you have Carlton and John writing the scripts, working off of, that book that, you wouldn't need to be changing too much. So how was it working on and finding the balance for a show, as we talked about, that dissects the ethics and like moral ambiguity of what is right when you're facing like an unimaginable situation? Like, what is that balance like when, up and down get turned around so much?
Whew. I mean, that's the big question. It's the whole question, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. You look like you were about to say something.
No, I mean, I think all of our intent, and I think as well as John and Carlton's, was to it's okay to live in that gray space of not having a clear defined answer and trying to bring honesty. I think all the actors tried to bring an honest performance. And in the same way, no judgment was, there were times where I think maybe early on, we're like, we don't want to tip our hand either way, sort of those conversations of anything, of like not being too one or the other, but making sure, that we're keeping steady and we're trying to show an honest and I think everybody was coming from a good place for the most part, and sort of making that be sort of our guiding light.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and
Sherry Fink's book is, obviously very well reported on. It's very detailed, and so I think, you follow that. If you follow that path with something that well reported, she's a journalist, and so she's trying to keep it as balanced as possible. So, sorry, Colin, you.
Yeah. I was just going to say, also working more closely with the latter three, which are more the episodes that are trying to get answers, even though it's also, I thought trying to also show that you can't have answers, but there's still this question of what happened and why. So working with those three, I did at times feel pulled into my own opinions and biases. And that's something we had to be careful about. And, at times like, oh, this music is too arch, so let's, not use that because that's tipping our hand in a certain way. And we also, I guess you could call it, we used the power of the cutting room floor a couple times and took some stuff out, also in flashbacks that sort of like was leaning too far in one direction. So we did have to sort of consciously, keep things a little bit more in that gray. And I think the gray was easier to find in the first five, which again is that space where we're living in empathy with the characters. So it's sort of easier to go into that gray space and kind of just show things as they were.
Yeah. The show seems like it's also purposely designed as like a Rorschach, where it's the idea of with distance, you can kind of have a certain sense of perspective, but the point is that you don't have that distance. And I think, there's a lot of really interesting stuff with that. Was there any, and if not, no worries, were there any moments that you may have been cutting or working on where you might have felt a character or a moment or empathy or a feeling was going one way, and then you got reactions that were not necessarily what you were expecting, whether that's bad, I think that's not necessarily bad, especially in a show that's like this, but was there a scene or a moment that was playing one way for you and then you get a different perspective and you realize like how many different ways there is to look at this story?
Yeah, it's
and not an easy question, so
no, it's not. It's
Question.
interesting. Yeah, there's a lot. It's a good question though. Yeah, it's there were, I don't know if there were anything as clear as that. I think there were things where once I at least for me, there were times when I didn't quite, as many times I read the scripts or read the scenes, I wouldn't actually quite understand what the scene was about until we got the footage. And so once I got the footage, I was like, oh, I get what this is about. I think for me, probably one of the clearest examples, and it's fairly minor, is when you first meet Dr. Poe with the nurses, and you're just like, oh, this scene is just her getting ready. And then you realize it's a little bit about the dynamic with her and the staff and stuff like that. And it's very subtle. And I think that's sort of the beauty of stuff that John and Carlton do, is like, it's so well written that it feels real and you're in it, but like there's a lot of meaning under these things that you don't necessarily clearly see. So but yeah, in terms of like purely like our perspective of the actual events and those scenes, I don't know if to me it was I never had that sort of flip-flop.
yeah.
I had one moment where King is witnessing, like in the distance, Poe injecting one of the patients, and it's so in the distance, and there's something happening in the foreground. They're having a prayer circle, and I know I had King witnessing it, and I know at one point they're like, whoa, this is registering too much with King. Like, this is too heavy. We need it to be like less, take the weight off of it. And so, that's kind of the thing, you're dealing with all these perspectives and like who gets the weight. And so, yes, in that moment, in a traditional sense, I want to be with him witnessing this and sort of feel that. But at the same time, we have to consider this other character's perspective and make sure we're not, again, tipping our hand in some way. And so that was one place that it was kind of like, wait, that's too much. Dial it back and just have it be a thing, and people will notice or they won't notice, and take the weight off of it.
Love it.
There's also a scene with Anna Poe and Susan Mulderick where they're speaking, and I think it can be interpreted in many different ways. And it almost seems like they may be speaking in code, but they may not be. It seems like they may have an understanding, a tacit agreement. They may not be. And that to me is one of the kind of ultimate sort of Rorschach-y scenes in the show.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring it up, because I feel like that was one of those scenes that we discussed a lot, I think, amongst ourselves about like, what and it was interesting. I think, not until towards the end did we ever ask John or Carlton what they thought that what each person was saying. So I think we were amongst ourselves kind of trying to figure it out. But and I think keeping that distance and perspective was good. And so, but yeah,
those are really fun moments when you have your thought and you're like, oh, it's so obvious, it's this thing. And then I talked to one of them, they're like, what? You think that, and you realize you have a completely different opinion about what's going on, even though we're on the same show.
Yeah.
Well, it's also a show that really holds the space for that too. It's
Yeah.
a show where like, it's the idea of who allegiance is, or even if allegiances should even be a word to be used, like that's kind of the deconstruction of that. So I think it's weirdly proof positive that even if internally you guys are like interpreting something different, but like are agreeing to like what's happening is kind of showing you're doing a good job.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the questions we often ask each other about different scenes was like, wait, is that person lying or is that person lying? Like you'd just be like, because the stories wouldn't line up, and you're just like, again, it's kind of Rashomon of it, right? We're like, I don't know. And so, you try to protect the reality of whatever. And I think you try to protect the reality of whatever you're trying to do at that moment. And that's what, that's sort of kept us in the even keel.
And I mean, what even is lying when you are stuck in that hospital for 5 days, and it's, how you're seeing things, but you're sleep deprived, adrenaline just, deprived, and, all you want to do is some semblance of safety. So as we get a little closer to the end, I have some fluffier questions. I would like you guys to choose a favorite moment from a different editor's episode and why you liked it.
Colin just mentioned one of my favorites of Joanne's, which was that this scene between Mulderick and Poe, and it's the heart of the show, but it's the heart of the question of the show, but there's all these subtle kind of moves with each of them, and both the actresses do such a phenomenal job with that. I mean, I remember taking a look at that scene, just the subtle facial expressions that each of them do, where you're just like, did you mean what you just said, or is that something else? And so I think that's phenomenal.
Thank you. There's a part at the end of episode 2, actually, and I'm maybe because I was more intimate with that episode, it was very cool to have some exposure with it and then see how someone else can take it and elevate it. And there was the final shot of Poe looking out the window, and we flash to all these, this chaos of what's happening in the outside world, and she's, trying to get hold of her husband. When I first saw that, I was like, oh, okay, it stood out to me. But when I watched it, and I liked it, but when I watched it later with a little bit of space, I loved it. I loved it. And Colin has done this thing too in some of his when he uses archival, where it's I know I emulated it in a certain space where it's just like the frenetic kind of like swipes, in addition to the chaos of what's going on. And I thought it was just like really brilliantly used there. And it was a place that, originally, the moment's the moment and it still has weight, but I felt like the way he did it like really elevated that whole ending in a way that I wasn't prepared for. So
I loved, thank you, by the way. I loved so much of what Lou did in 101 and 104. I think what I will choose to call out is the Frail Man, what we call the Frail Man sequence, which is maybe a little pejorative, but there's a sequence with an older patient in 101, kind of at the peak of the storm, who goes to the window and he looks out, and it's a great sort of series of, I guess you'd call them like violent cuts maybe, and Lou changed the aspect ratio while he did it, and there's these great audio cuts also, and seeing it at the premiere, in a real movie theater with great sound and stuff was really cool to see and kind of also feel it, and that's just like it's just an intense sequence that really just kind of like gets under my skin in a great way, and sort of really puts me in that space.
I also loved just the sound design of the opening too. Of just, the like, it's so freaky and, haunting.
It's so funny. I mean, when you guys talk about both those things, those were, I remember talking to John originally about that Frail Man sequence, and I was like, oh, my thought is desolate beauty. So it's like this old man, he comes and he looks at this thing, and it's like, it's both beautiful and horrific. And then John was like, I don't know if I agree. And then he wanted me to kind of toy with these like violent images of the storm. And I was like, oh, what is he going for here? And I remember sending him one, my first pass, and he's like, take another swing. and then just kept going back, and we ended up where we were. And yeah, it was fun to toy around with that stuff. But yeah.
It's Hitchcockian, not necessarily in the tension, but in kind of the violence of the cuts and the presentation. So finally, what are you guys watching that you're loving right now?
It's funny.
Old or new, by the way. It can be as old as the 20s if you want.
I don't know why. I guess it's partially why. One of the things that John had mentioned to us early on to watch was this, and I guess it would be considered Chinese New Wave. It's a movie called Elephant Sitting Still, and it's great. It's long. It's depressing as all hell, and like, but what kind of like made me think about it, and as soon as I finished 5 days, I started kind of going back and watching a lot of Wong Kar-wai movies. And so now what I'm doing literally right now is I'm going through the entire, I mean, it's not that he has that many movies, but I'm going through all of the Wong Kar-wai movies. So it's not TV per se, but it definitely reminds me of like what I love about the work that we get to do with John, but it's in a different perspective. But it has the same, as John likes to say, artful aspect to it. But yeah.
Yeah, that's really funny, Lou. Lou and I met up, a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. We talked a little bit about Wong Kar-wai. I was actually going to say that I had watched Fallen Angels, which is one of his movies from the 90s. And it's something that like the characters are largely like young and nihilistic, which is something at my stage of my life right now I'm identifying far less with. But like what I loved about it and his work and the work of other really great directors is that the style and the form of the movie or the show or whatever it is in concert with the theme or the intention of the piece. And it's a movie where everything is in concert, from the editing to the lighting to the production design, but it's also a depiction of the state that the characters live in. Everything's like really fractured, and there's these crazy like warped images, and everything's really fast, and they're jumping over the line and stuff like that. And it kind of just is an expression of the world that they live in that makes no sense.
and I don't know if you know this. Did I mention this to you, Colin? That Fallen Angels is technically, it was supposed to be the third story in Chungking Express.
Yes,
So
you did
it's-
tell me that. Yeah.
So it's like a weird thing, because the other thing is there's that actor that's in Fallen Angels that is an actor in Chungking Express, and you're just like,
Mhm.
they have the same number for whatever it is, you know, for either end of the story, but they're not the same character. But you're like, oh, is he saying something else? It's, I mean, and that's the nature of Wong Kar-wai too, though. I think it's like, I don't know. He's saying a lot.
Right.
So
I have not been catching up with my Wong Kar-wai, even though I love him and I think he's brilliant. I know I really haven't been watching anything, but I will say on my to watch list is Bad Sisters. I don't know if either of you have seen that, but I've
my
heard
sister just
such
mentioned that.
good
Yeah.
things and I'm so excited. I'm kind of wrapping up a job and that's like first on my list. So I'm excited to
Yeah.
watch.